Emilly had always tried to handle everything on her own. With 3 small children, her day felt like a marathon between work, home, and the needs of her kids. But every new day seemed to bring more responsibilities. The bills were piling up, work was pressuring her for results, and her children demanded more attention than she could give. Exhaustion was a constant companion, and Emilly silently wondered if she was losing control of her own life. Though she didn't admit it, she felt overwhelmed by the circumstances surrounding her. At night, Emilly would stare out the window, unable to sleep. Her mind raced with thoughts of all the things she could have done differently. What if I had saved more? What if I had chosen a different career? These thoughts only fueled her anxiety. She wanted to give her kids the best, but it felt like she was growing distant from them emotionally. The pressure to be the perfect mother was draining her energy, and each day seemed harder than the last. Sleepless nights became her new normal. Emilly would wake up in the middle of the night, quietly walking through the house, careful not to wake the kids, but feeling a tightness in her chest. She knew she needed help, but a voice inside her kept saying, "I should be strong enough to handle this on my own." She cried in silence, feeling more alone and frustrated with each passing day. It felt like she was walking a tightrope, with no one there to catch her as she fell. Her husband, always busy with work, rarely noticed the weight Emilly was carrying. For him, the most important thing was that the bills were paid at the end of the month. But Emilly wanted more than just to survive. She dreamed of truly living, but each day that dream seemed further away. She felt trapped in a maze, where every attempt to find a solution left her more confused and exhausted. The breaking point came one rainy afternoon. Rushing from one obligation to another, Emilly barely had time to catch her breath. The rain poured down, soaking her face, but she didn't care. All she wanted was a break, a moment to stop and think. But life didn't give her that chance. The clock kept ticking, and so did she. Little did she know, an unexpected encounter was about to change her perspective on what it really meant to have patience. In the midst of her hectic day, Emilly had an unexpected encounter. As she rushed back from one of her many commitments, she ran into Mrs. Rose, an elderly woman known in the neighborhood for her calm and wisdom. Seeing the exhaustion on Emily's face, Mrs. Rose called her over for a chat. "My dear, you seem to be carrying a burden heavier than you can handle," she said kindly. To her surprise, Emilly, who usually kept everything to herself, opened up. She shared her struggles, the lack of time, the exhaustion, and how everything felt like it was falling apart around her. Mrs. Rose listened intently, without interrupting, holding Emily's hands firmly. When Emilly finished, the older woman took a deep breath and said, "Life isn't meant to be controlled in every detail. Sometimes, what we need is not to fix everything at once, but to learn patience with the things we can't change. When you plant a seed, you can't force it to grow. You have to wait for the right time for it to bloom." These words resonated deeply with Emilly. It was the first time someone had spoken about patience in such a practical and real way. Still, Emilly wasn't completely convinced. She knew that Mrs. Rose's wisdom made sense, but her life was still a mess. "How can I have patience when everything is going wrong? I need a solution now," she thought while listening to the older woman's advice. Mrs. Rose, sensing Emily's resistance, smiled gently and said, "My dear, patience isn't about standing still and waiting. It's about continuing to move forward, but without despair. Trust that the right time will come." Those simple words stirred something within Emilly. After the conversation, Emilly felt a mixture of relief and confusion. Part of her wanted to believe what Mrs. Rose was saying, but another part was still clinging to the need to fix everything quickly. The older woman hugged her before leaving, offering one last piece of advice. "When life feels too heavy, don't be afraid to stop and breathe. Sometimes the answer lies in what you do while you wait." Emilly stood there, alone on the sidewalk, reflecting on those words. It was as if something was starting to change, slowly, inside her. Over time, Emilly began to realize that maybe patience was the missing piece in the puzzle of her life. It didn't mean giving up, but learning to face challenges without being consumed by them. Mrs. Rose had planted a seed of wisdom, and now it was up to Emilly to nurture that new perspective and wait for the right moment to bloom. Despite Mrs. Rose's words, Emilly still felt like her life was spiraling out of control. A few days after their conversation, things seemed to get worse. Her boss was pressuring her with impossible deadlines. Her kids got sick, and an unexpected bill arrived, threatening to throw her finances into even more chaos. The feeling of sinking returned with full force. That night, after an exhausting day, Emilly locked herself in the kitchen, crying quietly, trying not to wake the kids. The weight was unbearable, and she wondered if it was even possible to keep going. Sitting at the table, her head in her hands, Emilly remembered Mrs. Rose's words. Patience is the key that unlocks doors that despair is locked. Though she didn't fully believe it, she decided to try something different that night. Instead of asking for a quick fix to all her problems, as she usually did, she knelt and prayed for patience. It wasn't easy, but at that moment, all she wanted was the strength to endure and wait for the right time for things to fall into place. It was a simple prayer, but something inside her shifted. In the days that followed, Emilly began practicing patience in a more active way. Instead of trying to fix everything at once, she started addressing one problem at a time. It was a small change, almost unnoticeable, but it was making a difference. Her schedule was still full. The challenges were still there, but something inside her had calmed down. The anxiety of needing to solve everything immediately was replaced with an unexpected sense of peace. And this began to reflect in her attitude at work and at home. But the transformation didn't come without obstacles. Even though Emilly was determined to be more patient, there were moments when she felt like giving up. On one of those days, when it seemed like everything was falling apart again, she remembered the comparison Mrs. Rose had made to the growth of a plant. Things take time to grow, and forcing the process only makes it worse, she thought. Those words helped her take a deep breath and keep going. Even when everything seemed to be going wrong, Emilly's change wasn't visible overnight, but slowly, she began to feel a greater sense of lightness in her life. Work was still hard. The bills kept coming, but the way she reacted to these situations had shifted. By no longer trying to solve everything all at once, Emilly gave herself the space to handle each challenge in its own time. Patience was becoming her ally, and it was changing the way she approached life. In the days that followed, something curious began to happen. Instead of panicking over the lack of immediate solutions, Emilly started to accept that some things simply needed time to work themselves out. That's when she noticed something new. The more patience she practiced, the more her mind opened up to see new possibilities. Rather than focusing on the problems, she began to find small solutions that she had previously overlooked. It was as if, by slowing down, she gave space for the answers to naturally appear. One day, while standing in her backyard, Emilly noticed a plant she had planted months ago but hadn't seen any signs of life from. To her surprise, she saw that the plant was finally blooming. In that moment, she recalled Mrs. Rose's words. The patience Emilly had shown with that plant, without even realizing it, had allowed the natural process to unfold. And in that instant, the lesson became clear. Her life was no different. There was a right time for everything, and forcing a solution would only slow things down even more. This realization brought a new perspective to Emilly. She understood that by letting go of the need to control every detail and trusting in the timing of things, her life started to realign in unexpected ways. The bills that had once seemed overwhelming began to fall into place. At work, her performance improved because, by not giving in to despair, she was able to think more clearly and effectively. But the most important change was in her relationship with her kids. By letting go of the pressure to be a perfect mom, she found herself enjoying time with them more, without the anxiety of having to do everything at once. The most surprising moment came when Emilly was promoted at work. That promotion, which had once seemed impossible, came at a time when she had already stopped expecting immediate results. It was a recognition that came at the right moment, as a confirming that yes, patience had indeed worked. It wasn't something magical, but the result of months of dedication and an internal shift that was now being reflected in the outside world. Emilly felt a deep sense of joy, not just because of the promotion, but because she realized that patience hadn't made her lose time. It had helped her gain it. This transformation was profound for Emilly. What had once seemed uncontrollable was now under control, but not by her own hands. She had learned to trust in something bigger than herself, and it gave her a freedom she had never experienced before. Mrs. Rose's words, which once felt difficult to accept, now made perfect sense. Emilly finally understood that patience wasn't a weakness, but a quiet strength that changes everything around you in its own time. Over time, Emilly began to live with a new perspective on life. What once felt like a never-ending daily battle had transformed into a journey of learning and growth. Patience, which at first seemed like a weakness, became her greatest ally. Emilly realized that by letting go of the need to control everything and trusting in the process, the answers and solutions came at the right time. Her anxiety started to fade, and slowly, she began to feel a lightness she hadn't experienced in years. The biggest lesson Emilly learned was that patience doesn't mean doing nothing. On the contrary, it's about continuing to act, but without rushing, without the anxiety of wanting everything to happen all at once. She discovered that life is a process, much like the plants she admired in her garden. You can't rush the growth of a flower, just as you can't rush the important moments of life. Everything has its time, and forcing a solution often only leads to more frustration. Emilly also learned to appreciate the little moments. By letting go of the need to be perfect in all areas, she started to enjoy her time with her kids more, began taking better care of herself, and even rediscovered hobbies she had long abandoned. She realized that life was much more than just a checklist of tasks to be completed. It was about being present, enjoying the journey, and trusting that in the end, everything would fall into place. This transformation was profound and changed not only Emilly's life, but also the way she related to the people around her. Now, when her friends talked about their problems and the hustle of daily life, she shared the wisdom she had learned from Mrs. Rose. Patience is like a seed, she would say. If you know how to wait, it blooms at the right time and gives you the sweetest fruits. The most interesting part of this whole experience was that Emilly began to see challenges as opportunities for growth. She no longer avoided them, but faced them with calmness, knowing that every difficulty brought with it a lesson. Her transformation wasn't just external, in how she dealt with work or finances, but also internal, as someone who had learned to trust in the right timing for all things. And what about you? Are you ready to take the first step toward changing how you handle your challenges? Emilly's story shows us that patience isn't about standing still, but rather about acting at the right moment and trusting the process. Have you allowed impatience and anxiety to take control of your decisions? Maybe it's time to take a deep breath, step back, and see things from a new perspective. Think about it. What areas of your life could use a dose of patience to truly flourish? Remember, the best harvests come with time. Now, if you want to keep learning life-changing lessons, be sure to subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications. Here, you'll find more stories and wisdom to help you face life's challenges with strength and wisdom. Together, we'll walk this path of growth and transformation. Are you ready for